there's a real question of whether or not a trigger is useful for a business rule validation. And I've seen triggers that are extremely intense and heard of triggers with up to 7,000 lines of code inside the trigger. And that causes performance problems because remember, the trigger has to finish before the transaction can finish. So as users are inserting or updating or deleting, their transaction is extended and the locks for their transaction is extended while all that trigger code runs. So it's a good idea to use triggers for nice, tight validation of parts of the database, rules for the database, but not necessarily all the business rules. As an example of doing some kind of rule validation inside a SQL Server, what this trigger is going to do is in the CHA2 database, check to make sure every time a guide is assigned to an event, and if that guide is assigned as the lead for the event, that they're qualified as of the date of the event, their qualifications have not been revoked, and they are enforced. They have some kind of qualification. So this is just a nice, tight, multi-row, because we're looking at the inserted table, not doing a single row, but looking at the inserted, so we're handling multiple rows. So this is a nice, tight, multi-row check. And notice how it's taking place, too. It's saying if exists, which will return back a true or false if something is present. And this would find any row that violates the rule. It would violate the rule if the guide is the lead and either they don't have a qualification date for that particular event, there is some data in the revoke date, meaning their qualifications have been revoked, or the qualification date is inserted into the table for that guide, however, their qualification date is after the event begins. If any of this is true for any of the rows that are being inserted or updated, then this trigger will say, hey, this is a red flag, and we're going to just reject this entire transaction. So it's a full transaction go or no go. What we're not doing is something like a line item veto and saying, this guide is okay, this guide is not okay. So on an entire transaction basis, if there's any problem, if exists any problem whatsoever, then the if will be true, and we'll do the begin-end block, which is going to be a raise error. The lead guide's not qualified, and it's a status of 16 because, yeah, the transaction is not going to work, and we are rolling back the entire transaction. So let me go ahead and create this trigger using CHA2 and test it. And I've already set up the data just to prove this out, but guide number 1 for event number 10 is not qualified, which is why we got that error message down below generated by the trigger that said lead guide is not qualified, and the batch has been aborted. In the second test, guide number 2 is qualified for event ID 10. If we execute it, one row is affected and everything's fine.